The Real Estate Story with Adrian Butera.
Hi everybody and welcome to The Real Estate Story. Adrian Butera coming to you live from my daughter's bedroom. We are once again excited and delighted to bring you what I'm sure is again going to be a very special Real Estate Story episode here on the podcast, coming to you live through Facebook Live, but importantly to all those that are subscribed in through iTunes and Spotify and whatever your device is. Welcome along and joining us here today. My special guest, and I'll say friend going back to another country, we'll talk about more about that in a moment, is Steve Palise, the author of The Commercial Property Investor. Welcome along, Steve.
Hey Adrian, thanks for having me.
Hey, really delighted to have you along here today. It's actually, whilst we're together on Zoom this afternoon, it's the first time you and I have seen each other from a little trip to Papua New Guinea. Are people still surprised when you tell them that you've done the Kokoda track?
They are, but I'm starting to get a little bit of a resume with those walks. I've done base camp, much like you as well, and I did Kilimanjaro just before the COVID lockdown, which was really fun.
I saw some photos of that, so well done to you. You've ticked off the whole list. You should own, I've got a T-shirt that says Base Camp Kokoda in Kilimanjaro. You need to own that T-shirt. That's That's great. We got to know each other. How long was it when we did the Kokoda track? Was it 8 days, 9 days?
Yeah, 8 days.
Yeah, 8 days covering the track, and it was you were well versed because you had at that time completed base camp. But Kokoda, to me, was still harder than base camp. How do you feel?
It was still hard. Just because I've done base camp doesn't mean I actually trained for any of them. So I still drink heavily and don't run and do enough exercise. So no, it was still tough. As you remember, it was mainly just the long days and the heat that really got to you. The walking, besides the big hills, wasn't too bad.
Yeah, so I remember the climbs there at Kokoda. There were just harder climbs. Base camp was a gradual climb, constant, but the difficulty, the challenge, I guess, of base camp just was very different to Kokoda. I felt, but anyway, that was great.
How'd you find the altitude with base camp?
It was fine, except the final day when I ascended to, in fact, base camp itself. That last couple of hours, it hit me. Had incredible pain to my head, lost my peripheral vision, had my guide walking with me because I couldn't keep up with my group. And it was scary let me say, it was scary for at least a day. Once I'd reached base camp, we spent, I think, a couple of hours there and turned around and stayed back down. What's the very next village down? Can't remember, but
Maybe.
yeah. So we stayed there, and as we started to descend the next day, I got better instantly, but started on the drugs immediately and made a little bit of difference, but it was a bit scary to realise that that's what gets a lot of people up there.
Yeah, similar for Kilimanjaro as well. Like you do, I think it's 1,200 meters in the last day.
Whoa.
So you wake up at midnight and then basically walk 12, 16 hours straight.
Yeah, huge. That's really big. But again, a great achievement for you, ticking off all three. And I'm not sure I'll ever get to Kilimanjaro, but never say never, hey?
You'll get there a few years once this COVID nonsense goes away.
Yeah, this COVID nonsense, exactly. Well, we're still in stage, I don't even know what stage we're here in Victoria. I know that there's a lot of things that have been relaxed. I'll call it stage 3. We still have to work from home if we can work from home. You're obviously at home, but I want to not only cover our history together in Papua New Guinea, but I want to talk about what you have gone on to do, and then we'll talk a bit about your real estate career. But recently you have printed and published The Commercial Property Investor, the guide explained simply. Tell us a bit about that.
So basically, I'm a buyer's agent who buys commercial property for investors. So I do all the work. I find the properties, negotiate them, do all the due diligence, hold their hand through the whole process kind of thing. It just started off, I wanted to write like a 20-pager. This is what you need to know, critical points for commercial real estate. 20 pages turned into 50, 50 turned into 100. I looked at it and went, there's probably a book here. Finished the book, and then, book publisher picked it up. So it's in stores in January.
It's 266 pages.
I go on a little bit, I'll admit that. The funny thing is, I'm not even scratching the surface. It is literally still a summary guide.
So why commercial property? You're a buyer agent, but are you both commercial and residential?
Yep. So I started off in residential. I've probably got about 500 residentials under my belt. And then just slowly, just for diversification, started buying some commercial properties for clients. And then as you scratch the surface, you realize that they're actually a really powerful tool in your portfolio. And then started buying more and more of them. And now I'm buying about 10 a month. So quite a few. And yeah, you can get some good quality stock out there. But you have to understand it, though, which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
So mainly in the Sydney market because you're in Sydney, is that right, or just out of?
I'm in Sydney. However, most of my purchases aren't in Sydney or Melbourne at the moment.
Where are you buying?
I buy in every regional town, every capital city. In order, probably Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra, Hobart, Perth, and then Sydney, Melbourne.
Later, I want to talk about how commercial markets been affected by COVID, but let's go back to think normal markets. Let's explain simply, and there's 266 pages here that explains it simply, but what are the key elements to look for when buying commercial real estate?
So the big one for me, it's all about risk mitigation. So most people know you have to look at the tenant, make sure you have a good tenant, those type of things. But you want to find out what's going to happen if the tenant ever leaves. So that's the difference between commercial and residential. You might have a tenant leave your residential property and you have 1 week or 2 weeks vacancy. Commercial, depending on what you buy, where you buy, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months. If you don't know what you're doing, it could be 2, 3 years. So you really, for me, it's vacancy. There's obviously more factors in that. You've got to look at what infrastructure spending is going in, what the population growth is, the demand for that type of industrial asset, because obviously an office space needs to be treated differently to a retail. But yeah, there's a list of about 20 items you need to go through just to find out if it is a good commercial.
And if we were to sum up, what commercial properties can we put in the umbrella under the umbrella of commercial real estate? Obviously, retail, shop fronts as we know them. What other forms of commercial property are out there?
Yeah, right. So industrial, so that's things like warehouses and fabrication houses, things like that. Retail, as you mentioned, and then office space. They're the three main ones. There are the special ones, such as like a lot of people will buy land and they'll have farming done on the land, or like a resort or a nursing home and things like that. But the key ones: retail, industrial, office space. Basically, a commercial is any property or land that has business activity running from it. So that's the definition. So you could still have a residential property that might be, say, converted into a medical center or a dentist. That, even though it's bare bones is a residential property, is effectively a commercial property because there's a business enterprise running out of it. Now with COVID, obviously a little bit different because everyone's working from home, but if the profit's made from the premise, that's generally why.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's well summed up, very simply. What about the word yield? Now, years and years of experience, I think I have, 3 decades in fact. I think it took me at least a third of that time to work out what a yield was. Can you explain what a yield is simply?
Simply, it is basically the yearly rent over the purchase price. So when you're talking residential yields, you're talking a gross yield. So that's taking into account no other costs such as maintenance, outgoings, council rates, water rates, things like that. In the commercial realm, you refer to it as a net yield. And the reason it's called net yield is most leases, the tenant actually pays the outgoings. So the only cost you're effectively going to have is property management if you have one, and whatever debt you have on the property.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that's really well explained. And when an agent is advertising a property and stipulates the yield, that would be off the purchase price,
Yeah,
the
that's
asking price.
the asking price.
The asking price, I should say. Yes, correct. Yeah, there you go. And Steve, so before we dive into the book and some of the components within the book or some of the subjects, tell me more about your history. How did you get into this? How long have you been doing real estate? Tell me more about buyer's agent. Do you work for yourself or a firm?
No, I work for a firm, a really good firm called Rethink Investing. So we've been around 5 years, and I was pretty much at the start. Prior to that, I studied structural and mechanical engineering at uni. Did really well. Got a job designing biomedical machines. Then I started designing mine sites. And then just casually was growing my residential portfolio. And then, yeah, 5 years ago, came across the owner of Rethink Investing, Scott O'Neill, who basically offered me a job. So, random career change. And since then, we've done about 1,800 properties.
Wow, that seems like a lot of transactions. I don't think my firm's done 1,800 properties in the last 5 years, let me tell you. So well done to you, credit to you. So you've led on, you've gone in the book and you said, right, we'll write 20 pages and it ends up being 266 pages. And as I'm looking at the book, there's a couple of areas that I want to ask some questions. So firstly, if I'm looking at buying a commercial property and I love residential, and residential's been very generous to me in capital growth, which commercial properties generally get better capital growth than other commercial properties?
It's similar to residential. It's all going to come down to demand. On average, though, to make a general statement, from what I've seen, the ones that are obviously in good locations that are going to have good infrastructure spending, population growth, high demand, ones with a land component, I find grow more as well. So, like a freestanding building is going to outperform a high density office space, for instance. But much like residential, where apartments grow slightly differently to houses, things like that. On average, in the last 30 years, most of them have grown between 5 and 6% um,
Annually?
annually.
Yeah.
So similar growth, but again, it just depends what you're buying. Like a main street retail shop front is completely different to the one 2 streets back. They're going to have different growth rates. So me saying that main street one having 6% doesn't really apply to the one 2 streets back because it has zero foot traffic. So it all comes down to that's the key difference with commercial as well. Every single property, even the ones next to each other, need to be treated differently because they're different tenants, different foot traffic, different road traffic, demand, different lease terms, different types of businesses. There's a lot more kind of alternating things. It's not just you get a tenant in there and that's kind of it like residential.
Yeah, certainly. I'd love to hear your comments about uh, not only best possible use for a building where you're looking to seek a new tenant, but where the neighbours are doing the same, and the neighbours attract a tenant that may give you greater foot traffic. That would increase the rent, or would it keep it the same? Because I like to look at surrounding areas when I'm looking at commercial property.
I assume you're referring to retail because that's
I am,
typically
yeah, retail,
where the
yes.
neighbours move it. It's again, it's case by case basis. Like something like a Woolworths or a Bunnings or something like that, they get a much cheaper rent because they know they're going to bring other business to the area, or they're on a longer term or a more stable business, for instance. Um, I think you're getting at, say, if you've got a shopping centre and there's a couple key anchor tenants, so you might have your pharmacy, your medical centre, your supermarket, then you want a really good mix of the other tenants because there's no point having three bakeries competing against each other because no other investor is going to come in and buy in. And to be honest, no other business is going to come in. They want the foot traffic. So with a retail centre, the main aim is getting people through the centre. There's different ways you can charge them rent as well. It's not as simple as we're going to charge you XYZ dollars per square metre. Some do it on revenue plus, others do it on fixed annual increases, some just do it on shorter terms. It's case by case. It's actually an unregulated industry. Retail is slightly different, that's regulated, but industrial and office space is. Yeah, it's just, again, it's case by case.
What about, gone are the days where we used to drive down the main street of a particular town or suburb and you'd see half a dozen car yards in a row because the consumer would respond accordingly. They'd go from one car yard, go to the next, go to the next. And whilst we still see examples of that, but they rely on the car buyer foot traffic to go to all those cars. I mean, that market seems to have changed because of the digital environment. What else is changing within?
Yeah, that still applies though, Adrian. It's just like you'll get a lot of the times in like industrial centres where you'll have home and hardware stores and things
Yeah.
like that. They all keep together because they know people just want to do it in the one trip and go fit out their house, for instance. So that comes in. The main thing that's changing now is obviously office space culture.
What's
So
going to happen there? COVID's changed everything, it feels like.
it is so CBDs. I think are going to have a bit of a rough trot for the next 2 or 3 years. It'll come back slowly, but again, you'll probably need population growth to kind of get there. Even if people come back, say 50% of the time, we're still 50% below where we're at. So I'm a firm believer people need human interaction, so they are going to keep the 2 or 3 day kind of work culture week. But at the moment, for me and my clients, we're not really touching high density office space. It's this too big of an unknown for us. We're mainly sticking with retail and industrial.
Yeah, just don't go there. I must say, within our own business, we would be leasing anywhere from 6 to a dozen industrial type properties monthly at the moment, all the way through the pandemic, which has been, it's really surprised me. And it's been people downsizing, people upsizing, and there's been a few entrepreneurs saying, right, I'm going to start a business, so I'll lease a factory because that's where I need to operate from.
Funny you mention that. So industrial vacancy rates are actually tightening since COVID.
Yeah, amazing.
But the world doesn't stop moving. So, like, if even though there's COVID, we still need car mechanics, spray painters, wholesalers, distributors, fabricators, storage. All that world keeps moving. So, if anything, distribution's actually gone up because a lot of people are getting lazier and they can't actually leave their homes, so they're actually getting things sent to them. So, a lot of my clients are seeing like high interest in distribution centers.
Steve, so if we identify a property that we want to buy, firstly, we make the decision that we want to look at commercial real estate. We identify a property. What's that initial due diligence look like? I know you made some comment here in the book in setting yourself up for that initial due diligence, but share some of that with our listeners today.
Right. So first and foremost, you'd have a look at the area. So you got to look at what's going on in the area. What area is that type of commercial property servicing? So if you're looking at industrial, is it an industrial center in, say, like a residential area? So is it just servicing that in a residential area, or is it near an airport or a port, for instance, where they're doing shipping? Find out what they're servicing. Then you look at the type of business and say, is this the right business that should be here? Will they be successful long term? And then you do your due diligence on that. So you find out how long have they been there, who their competitors are, what are their plans, are they upsizing? Sometimes a really successful business might actually upsize because they're going to outgrow the space they're buying. So you look at that, and then you obviously got to check the figures. So if they're saying you're getting a 7% net yield, check that that's right, and make sure that the tenant's paying fair market rent or below fair market rent, because there's no point overpaying for a property if the rent's wrong. That's actually a good point to note as well. A lot of the commercial property value comes from the actual rent you receive. So vacant properties will actually sell differently quite often to tenanted properties. And then, as I touched on before, vacancy is a huge one for me because the periods are longer with commercial. You really need to dig deep on that. And that's not as simple as residential where you can just look up a stat. You actually have to do some hard digging and find out, like, say you're buying an industrial complex, find out the other properties in the complex, if they went vacant, how long they went vacant for. Then go to the adjoining complexes, find out if anyone went vacant there and how long they were vacant for. Then speak with property managers on the ground and ask about demand, if there's waiting lists, how long things are taking to be tenanted. So there's a lot more actual work to actually get it done.
What about you? Maybe I'm going to ask a question about tenant and business analysis. I think you just started to touch on that, but just can I pause that a second? Talking about rent, I've seen in some marketplaces where the leasing agent is so good that he or she is able to get 10 or 15 or a larger percentage what would seem to be the market rent. That puts, in my opinion, huge pressure on the tenant to meet that rent, even though the tenant agrees. Is there areas that there's certain sustainable rents? Just because a tenant says yes and agrees to pay it, in some cases, that's a lot of coffees that these coffee shops needs to sell. It's a lot of retail clothing these clothing shops need to sell. What responsibility falls back on the owner in saying what's the fair rent? Do they just listen to the agent, or do they look at the whole market?
I look long term because I want to keep my tenant for as long as possible, and you're basically going into business with them. So you want them to do well. But if the market's dictating a high rent and that's where it's at, and it's not affecting vacancy on the properties, then that's the going rate. I thought the same thing 5 years ago when Sydney, Melbourne went gangbusters, that this is unsustainable. We can't have this, but here we are. And it's still somewhat similar now.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Okay, so let's go back to tenant and business analysis. Is that what you mean by looking at the tenant and seeing if are they going to be able to pay the rent? What sort of business? Is it a business under threat? If someone wanted to lease my shop and they wanted to open up a clothing store or a retail business right now, personally in Melbourne, retail business has been knocked around. I want to know that they're a bit different than just another clothing shop. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you just got to go through the history and do a full analysis of them. So if they're existing business, it's obviously a bit easier because you can see how long they've been operating, what's their growth rate. You can even check their rental ledgers. So you can go to all the other previous property managers and find out have they paid their rent and their bills on time. And if they're a growing business and they're profitable and they've always paid their bills on time for the last 5 years, some even tenants will give you their P&L statements to show you that they're profitable as well because they might it might be an in-demand space that they want to move into. So you can check all that. New businesses is a lot harder to gauge. As you know, it's 90% or I think it's 95% of new businesses fail in the first 3 years. So that one's a bit more difficult to gauge. That one you'd have to do a really deep kind of market analysis and see are they offering something special? Can they come in? But in addition to that, then you can check things like guarantees. So if you're putting someone on, say, a 5-year lease, you can see what they've put up as a guarantee. Sometimes it's the owner's house, for instance, as collateral, so you can get some security that way.
Yeah, certainly, part of that whole leasing process and contracts, we had commercial lawyer on one of the episodes only recently, and we went through all of
I
that.
listened to that one.
Yeah, he spoke so well and gave some wonderful insights in 30 minutes, and I hope plenty of landlords and plenty of tenants were listening to that because it was a great insight for both. Let's talk about financing. I'm not going to ask you to be a finance expert, but lending to commercial real estate is very different to residential, isn't it?
Yep, very different. You can get the standard loans, the 15, 20, 25-year, 30 loans. Generally, though, you need a larger deposit. So you'll need a 30 to 35% deposit. There are a couple lenders like ANZ at the moment are doing 80% loans, but just as a blanket statement, you'll generally need a 30% deposit, so quite a lot. But there's also some different options for lending as well. So you can actually get what things called lease loans, where they'll actually give you a loan based on the strength of the lease, and they'll give it for you the time the lease is. So if
What's the
you
strength of the lease? Explain that to us.
basically like the serviceability of the lease and like what the guarantees are, how long it is, what return it's actually giving, and then they'll give you the loan based on that as well. So if you buy something on a 5-year lease, they'll give you a 5-year loan. At the end of the 5 years, you'll have to reassess and refinance to if they get a new 5-year loan, things like that. They're quite good for people that are starting to get to their kind of glass ceiling in terms of their residential capacity and
Right.
their serviceability. It can give them that little kickstart. But again, you want to assess your risk and make sure you're not doing anything silly.
Yeah, okay. So certainly some challenges there. So anybody venturing into the commercial property market, you need to get your broker in that does. Would it be fair to say you need a broker that specialises in commercial real estate lending?
Yeah, it definitely needs some runs on the board. You'll get some residential ones that say they can do it, but they'll effectively go to the big four, and then you might get knocked back. I've had ones before the clients have told me they can't get any finance, and then I've put them on touch with my guy, and all of a sudden $1 million has came out of the air.
Everybody's got a guy, Steve. Everybody's got a guy. My guy.
Like
So
commercial, you're 100% spot on. You need them to know what they're doing because there's different types of loans, and there's even commercial only lenders as well, which the residential ones won't even have access to on their
yeah,
business.
that's right. There you go. Let's say I want to try and attract an anchor tenant. I want to attract one of the big, publicly listed, big corporate companies. Let's say retail, and use that as an example. I want attract them into my space, or I want to buy a property and then convert it and improve it. Let's talk about how do we attract the right people, and do we need to improve commercial properties to attract the right people?
So you're referring to if you're buying, say, a vacant property,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
you can do all those types of value adds, much like residential, where you can refurbish it, renovate it, make it look pretty, and that normally will command a higher rent. And you can obviously get some capital growth that way as well. You can kind of do some renovations and make 10, 20% there. You just got to work out and service what market you're kind of going for. So, like if you're trying to go for, say, an anchor medical tenant, you want to make it very attractive to a medical tenant. Sometimes you'll even advertise just for medical tenants and offer incentives. So you might give them 3 months free rent so they can fit it out with all the medical machines, things like that. The big anchor tenants are a lot more difficult. You also don't get the same return as well because they know they've got the bargaining power as well.
Yeah, right. I've never thought about that, that they feel like they've got the bargaining power. I thought they just want to be somewhere, so therefore they'll pay the money to be there. But
It depends what it is, what scale it is, obviously. But generally, the bigger ones, they know they've got the and I look at if I've got a property where I can get 7% for a low level tenant, or I can get say 5.5% from a really big tenant, I'm definitely considering the big tenant.
Steve, tell me, let's go through this little analogy. If I have $500,000 and I want to buy a commercial property, I'm committed on that. And I came across to your firm, where would you guide me? What part of Australia? What sort of real estate? What would we be buying
Yeah.
for 500?
So in terms of location, it's completely dependent on the type of property. Like a industrial space in out of Melbourne might be a poorer investment than one in Brisbane CBD, for instance. So ideally, I just look everywhere. There's obviously other facets as well. If they're heavily invested in a certain state, we might look for diversification in a different area. But it's going to come down to the property itself. If it's your first one, I'm basically just trying to get as big a return as I can with as low risk as possible. So I'd buy a first-time investor a really versatile asset.
Can you
So
give us an example what that might look like?
so industrial space is perfect as
Right.
a versatile asset because it can be any types of tenants can move in there. Like I just bought one recently that's a CrossFit gym, so that's up in Brisbane. In 2 years' time, 3 years' time, theoretically, if the tenant moved out, could then become a warehouse, like a mechanic could move
Yes.
in. So that's a really versatile one. What I like about things like industrial is you can actually get direct comparables as well, because I can show you per square meter what they rent for in the adjoining complex, and then I can move that diameter out and go as far as I want, just to get some like confidence in the numbers. Whereas something like, say, I'm buying you a suburban cafe and it's in a little strip of 3 or 4 shops, there's not that many comparable properties I can show you. I can show you those 3 or 4 shops, and if one of them's a nail salon, the other one's a barber shop, and then there's a cafe, they're all completely different assets. That one's a little bit more of a black art. So you kind of got to kind of assess where you're at, look at the population growth, things like that. Whereas industrial, I like it. It's pretty much all about the numbers. You'll still look at what type of things you're servicing, because then there's a proportion mix of warehouse to office space. So some areas like 50% office and mezzanine compared to 50% floor space. Other more heavy industrial areas want more floor space. They might be 10% office space, 90% floor space.
And so would that advice vary if I had a couple of $1 million to spend? I wanted to be guided. I said, Steve, look, I've invested in Melbourne for the last decade. I want to think broadly. I want to think Australia. Melbourne's had a lot of risk about it in almost every property sector. I want to leave my investing out of Melbourne. Where would you take me with a couple of $1 million? What sort of property would I be looking at?
It depends kind of what you've got an inkling for, but like generally, like I said before, retail, like or suburban retail. I'm not doing CBD retail at the moment, or industrial. A couple million gets a few more options though, because you can buy things like, instead of buying one cafe or nail salon, you can actually buy a whole strip of shops. So you could buy something. I bought one up in Brisbane's in Moreton Bay, if you know where that is, a whole strip for about 1.8 million.
Wow.
That had 5 tenants.
That seems really reasonable.
It is. So you get out of Melbourne and Sydney, and the prices are just really, really, really achievable. So, and then even still, you can buy some on the outskirts of some cities. You can buy some multi-tenancy warehouses. So you might get one that's actually got 2 tenants, and then that diversifies your risk that way as well. Because if you do lose a tenant in 5, 10, 15 years, you've still got 50% rent coming in.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. And I'm keen to say, how have things changed? And I think we've largely covered this through a few topics. But COVID, we know it's impacted Melbourne significantly because of the additional lockdowns. But how you've said you're not advising clients to invest in office in CBDs at the moment, is that right?
As a general statement, yes, there's got to be some type of driver. We still buy some offices, but they may be like, they're effectively a retail space. So maybe similar to your real estate agencies, where they're effectively an office, but they could be a retail. Tomorrow they could be a hairdresser.
Yeah, right. That's some good advice. Steve, it's been great to have you on the show. I know the book is 266 pages long. The book is the Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply. When's it going to be out in bookstores, or how do people order if they want to?
Yep. So you can go to www.paliseproperty.com to get pre-order it. I get 1,000 copies in about 2 weeks' time, so I can start sending them out. It hits stores mid-January, so it'll be all major retailers. You can currently buy it on Amazon and Booktopia and all those types of sources.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I'm so pleased to see you again. It's been a long time, and it's great to see you've gone to the extent you've written this book. I'm looking forward to getting my copy, and well done to you. Real credit. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for tuning in to The Real Estate Story. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate it.
The Real Estate Story brought to you by Compton Green.